In the interest of telling stories, because I really think that's what today is about, I wanted to just share a little bit about why I have chosen to focus so much on the intersection of poverty, the environment, and climate change. So I grew up in a family of environmentalists. It was very clear to me as a child that there was sort of a morally right thing to do, and that was to care about conservation and care about the animals whose beautiful images you've shared with us. When I was 12, I traveled with my parents to Madagascar, and I saw the practice of slash and burn agriculture, where farmers who had the immediate need of feeding their families that day were clearing some of the most incredible ecosystems on the planet. And my childhood brain was completely blown by that. It felt like a morally ambiguous thing. I think one of the first morally ambiguous things I felt like I had ever encountered. And I think what it made me realize that left a very, very deep impression, which was that we can't really think about conservation without also thinking about poverty. Now, climate change is also making, I think, many of us in this room who've spent our lives thinking about poverty realize we can't think about poverty without also thinking about the environment. And we're going to hear today from people who've also really devoted their lives to poverty, to the environment. I think I want to highlight three things that I think you'll be hearing about throughout this session that really kind of, I think, show this inextricable link between climate and poverty. The first is that when we think about who are the populations that are going to be most impacted by climate change, it's really the poorest and most vulnerable in the world. And this is both because of where poverty is distributed around the planet. It's in the places that are already relatively harsh, relatively hot environments. These are the places that are increasingly going to be uninhabitable going forward. They're going to be places where it's very difficult to produce the food that people need. But in addition, the poorer you are, the fewer resources you have to adapt. So when climate change, comes knocking, you don't have the ability necessarily to change your livelihoods, to, change what you're doing to feed your families. And so conversely, in some ways, the best adaptation technology that we know of is to get richer. That richer households, even in poor places, are more resilient to climate shocks. That richer places themselves, even kind of holding equal the climate, are more resilient to climate shocks. And so that makes, in some ways, this kind of task of thinking about what is effective in poverty alleviation even more pressing. Finding ways to alleviate poverty is finding ways to help people adapt to climate change. And yet the third challenge is that, as far as we know, the economic development process is a fairly carbon-intensive one. And so really trying to think carefully about what are the ways to enhance livelihoods, to make people more resilient, that don't, in turn, sort of exacerbate this crisis that we're facing, I think is one of these enormous, enormous challenges. And so it can feel completely overwhelming in the face of all of that to think about, how do we possibly move forward? What can we possibly do? And I would argue that poverty often feels that way as well. It feels like this kind of insurmountable threat that very hard to think about how to make progress on. And I'm honored to be part of JPAL, where I think the sort of pragmatic approach to finding the things that work has been a source of hope for a lot of people. And I think changing, sort of redirecting that to, not redirecting, but also directing that to think about climate and to think about this kind of intersection of climate and poverty is a way to actually start to think about making progress, to find the things that work, to also find the things that don't work and not spend the scarce resources that we have for climate on those things. That is a way forward. And so I encourage you all to join us in thinking about how to make that happen. So thank you. So Amy, I'm going to turn it back over to you. I think James Mwenda is going to join us on stage. Yes. So conservationist and entrepreneur. And Amy, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Thank you. Have a seat. Thank you so much. I guess let's start. James is one. I met James because James is an ambassador to Old Pejeta, where the northern white rhinos are. And I met him many years ago. You were caring for the northern white rhinos, and a passionate conservationist, and I thought we could start with maybe talking about your own background. I mean, in my experience, what I saw when I first started working in this space was that it is a very impenetrable field to get into in a lot of ways. Like growing up in Kenya, how did you get into this field of conservation? And maybe you can begin with your story.
Right. Thank you so much for having me. I'm truly humbled to be, here today. It's a long story, and I will try to make it as short as possible. And also being here, in JPAL, celebrating 20 years of helping people with poverty and helping, issues that affect it is really paramount to me because I grew up in a very poor household. Almost everything was a need. I just grew up in below Mount Kenya, which is the second tallest mountain in Africa. Almost everything was a need when I was a baby. Just only water was the thing we could afford the most because we came very close from the forest. And it was hard growing up. Going to school, we were that family and those kids that a lot of people would laugh at. We are those kids who went to school with tattered clothes, slept with goats and on a kitchen that had roofs that are worn out. And I grew up asking myself why we were poor and what I will do about it. And my teachers would tell me that the only thing that would help me out was, working hard in school and getting good grades and getting a quality education. And I listened to them and I did that. A lot of struggles, through primary school, but at the end of the day, I was able to finish the primary school. And after finishing primary school, I came to my dad when I was 12 and a half years old, and I asked him, Dad, what are you planning to take me to high school? And I think that's when the whole turnaround around my life came, because Dad told me, you're almost 13, you're becoming an adult, you have to go out and figure out what life is. And I think it was the most heartbreaking moment in my life. I even considered, committing suicide because I didn't know what a 13-year-old would do, and never worn a shoe. My hopes were to go to school and study. And, growing up in the village, we did everything to survive. My mom had like a little farm just close to the forest that she used to, grow crops that would feed the family, and the surplus would be sold. And unfortunately, elephants would come from the forest and would come and eat away everything that was in the farm. And when I was 10, I knew that I wanted to go to school and study to be a conservationist. And when I realized that could not happen, that's when my heart was so broken, because I could see the pain my community was going through. I could see the struggles we were facing, having these animals come overnight, eat everything that was in the farm. And I had to stay for like 8 years at home, working as a gardener before I could get an opportunity to go back to high school again when the government came with a free education. And that's when I enrolled back again to school when I was like 21. I think one of the greatest challenges I've had to face. But I worked hard because I still believed that getting a quality education was something that would help me. But again, after finishing high school with a lot of difficulty as well, because I had to provide everything for myself, I couldn't join the university because I missed a few points to get a regular degree. And that's how I ended up pursuing my passion, which was working in conservation, and that's how I ended working in Opegita. And I wasn't prepared that I would be one of the men that would be taking care of the last remaining rhinos on the planet. And that what it has taught me is about why we need to stand up and look into the environment and everything that lives in it as part of us. And if we take care of it, the planet will take care of us. So that's my story.
Oh, thank you, James. You're amazing. And you pointed out one thing that I just want to back up and talk about, because, I think a lot of people in the West often romanticize living with wildlife, how wonderful that is. But really, you mentioned elephants can come and eat your crop in one day that you've been spending months cultivating. And how is it that, I mean, I can personally understand how people want to, perhaps kill the wildlife. When you live that close to wildlife, it's a very different thing. And maybe you can speak to how did you understand there was a different path? Why did you want to work to save these animals who were destroying your food?
So as a little boy, when I was around 9, 10, my mom tells me the conflict was so severe that the community would try to do anything they could, either to kill the elephants, because they didn't have the power to bring them back into the forest. And the most exciting part of all of this was, to me, to see the rangers come. They would come with their uniforms and the car and the guns, and they would blow up in the sky the blanks and chase the elephants back into the forest. And that's why my desire to get into conservation was like, so there is a solution to this, that we can understand these animals, we can find a way to live with them. So my idea was to go to school, learn about these animals, come back into the village, and be able to protect the community and the elephants. And it seems very easy because living with these animals, people feel it's a cool thing, but it's a great sacrifice, especially in Kenya. Being a ranger, which I worked for as a ranger for 10 years, is the lowest job in the category in Kenya. It's ranked the same as the police. It's the least paid job, in the country. When I'm doing school talks and I go to school and ask kids how many would want to be a ranger, you can barely see a hand raising up of any kid that would want to be a ranger, because it's not a fancy career. Kids want to go and be doctors, engineers, pilots, and all these other fancy. So it's a job that comes with a lot of sacrifice. If you're working in the front lines, you either can face attacks from wild animals. If you're not running away from a buffalo, you're running away from a lion. If you're not running away from a lion, you're running away from an elephant. If it's not an elephant, it's a poacher who still wants to kill you to get the products that these animals have. So it's a job that requires a lot of sacrifice, but it's also a job that someone has to do. And that's why rangers and the people on the front lines have to sacrifice all that much to make sure that the world and the environment is taken care of.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? And Kelsey, do you have questions? Okay. So is it just a question of more pay? I also, in my experience, it does feel like it is very difficult to get into that space. And what are the obstacles for you? Is it, can you keep going as a conservationist? How do you move forward?
Well, conservation for the longest time has not been seen as a local thing, so sadly so to say. It's been mostly a lot of people who have been involved in conservation, especially locally, were people that were not either local. And as a small young village boy, trying to come and have a voice in the conservation space was a lot of hurdles I had to jump. Because it was dominated by voices that have been there for the longest time, and you trying to find a voice in between was a great challenge. So a lot of people have not seen, and especially locally, have not seen themselves as part of the solutions that are needed to make the environment, or rather to protect animals like we have seen the rhinos and the elephants. And overcoming that by itself and the opportunities that came with me, especially taking care of the last remaining rhinos and all the places I've gone to speak about conservation and all of that, a lot of people would wonder and ask, how did you come? Because I've been following conservation for nearly 20, 30 years. I never see someone locally talking about it. So it's a space that a lot of we, the local young people, needs to get into, but also build the understanding that conservation is not just a career for certain people. It's also more of a moral responsibility for us to take care of the environment, both whether it's locally or internationally. I think appreciating what nature does for us helps all of us to understand our position in it, and that's that's kind of why the reason why I'm motivated to overcome all those hurdles to be where I am.
And can you talk about, I mean, you know how climate change is really impacting communities, even Vitale, Old Pejeta. Can you talk about what you're seeing and how communities are actually adapting? Can they adapt?
It's a very serious subject, especially when you know, like Kenya, for instance, is coming out of a 5-6 year drought that has been really has affected us as a country. And it's really worrying to see what climate change is causing. I mean, a lot of, especially if you think about northern Kenya, where they are nomadic pastoralists, and thinking about Kenya as well, agriculture being, you know, the biggest thing that people do. It's really tragic. You know, we've seen lots of animals that have been lost because of the drought that we've had, and now the rains have come and they're washing away the land that was already barren from the drought. And there's not so many ways with which these people can adapt to it. You know, it's becoming a challenge for the communities to even live their way of life again. After having lost a lot of livestock, then losing everything to the floods, it's a heartbreaking times. And it's something that needs to be addressed in the way that these communities can understand how to adapt to the prevailing climatic changes, and help them either know when these things are about to happen or know how better to cope with them. And I feel it's something that needs to be, you know, invested in to help make that these communities continue thriving. So it's happening, it's affecting not only the nomadic but also the farmers, which pushes them now to exploit more of the natural resources we have, knowing that a lot of local people that live there rely on natural resources, and then the more they exploit it, the more they're making it vulnerable to the climate crisis.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, Kenya's done a lot of things right and some things wrong. Can you, from your perspective, what are they doing right and what could be done better?
Well, Kenya has made so much stride in terms of conservation. Really happy that the government comes into conservation and tries to enforce the laws and the policies, but also driving the agenda of people-driven conservation efforts, you know, where a lot of people understand their role in making the environment better, protecting the species that we have, by the fact that the government made the wildlife to be the national treasure that everyone can appreciate. I think it's some of the reason why it's doing well, because a lot of people are now understanding why we need to have, you know, these wild animals and these wild spaces well protected and looked into after. But just like every other country, there's a lot of challenges with corruption and ratio issues in conservation that impedes and that derails the process of making it a complete success. So with that, it's why we continue hoping that we can have ways with which there can be inclusion in such issues and make sure that you know, we can embrace conservation to be, you know, part of our lives on an everyday basis.
Yeah. And since it's the 20th anniversary of JPAL, let's look into the future. What do what are your aspirations and hopes, not just for yourself, but for Kenya, for conservation globally? What do you see coming?
I mean, I can completely applaud JPAL for what they are doing to help alleviate poverty. I mean, if I can take back my years and if I had such an opportunity to be able to get a quality education, be in school when I was needed to, maybe my life would be much better or be in a greater position than I am. So I can really commend them for the work they're doing to help alleviate poverty and improve the lives of people that live in very poor conditions. I can only hope for more opportunities for children that were born in those poor environments, that have no hope for a tomorrow, that have no hope for a future, that they look around their lives every day and wishing that it can be better. I can only hope for that future and hope that we all can have a medium where there's no people living in extreme poverty, and that they all can be able to see the light, to be able to afford the basic needs on an everyday basis. And I feel like that would be more impactful even for us all.
James, you're a huge inspiration. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, James and
Thank you.
Amy, for
Thank
the
you.
inspiring work that you do.
Thank you.
We're going to now be joined virtually, joined via video, I should say, by Hindu Ibrahim, who is the president of the Indigenous Women and Peoples Association of Chad. She couldn't be here with us, but please join me in listening to her message.
Hi everyone, I am very happy to be with you today, even it is through video, to celebrate the 20 years of improving life through evidence. 20 years of great action for people like mine and for those who well deserve your support. Of course, we should celebrate Positive Day. But it is very hard to stay positive in this world where my people and many other indigenous peoples around the world facing the consequences of climate change every day, in addition to other crises around the world that create more poverty and injustice. Let me share with you who I am as indigenous woman. I come from indigenous called Mbororo. We are pastoralist, nomadic, and semi-nomadic people living around all the Sahel region. Our way of life is moving from one place to another one to find water and pastures, and at the same time, our cow dung help the land to get fertile in a natural way. We live in harmony with the nature. We are nature. Since 2 decades, my people are facing the extreme weather event, from drought that dry everything to the floods that wash everything, and the heat wave that reduce our food production, where our social and economic lives is destroyed. Conflict between communities to access the remaining natural resources is rising everywhere, and people are fighting each other. Lake Chad, who used to be one of the largest lakes in Chad, who is 25,000 kilometers square of fresh water when my mother get born, lost 90% of his water. And more than 40 million people living and depending of this fragile ecosystem. This is one of the most challenging aspects of climate injustice. For women, it is even more challenging because if man cannot work with our cattle to produce milk, they leave the communities to find jobs in the cities, leaving women and children on their own in the rural areas alone to face these consequences. That is one of the reasons I became a climate advocate. And with my organization, we work with the communities to build solutions. In a small-scale project, the example is we develop tools to support communities to fight against climate change. We build a 2D and 3D participatory mapping by using science, technology, and the traditional knowledge of my people that help to map the natural resources and develop adaptation strategy. Amy Vitale, my friend here in the room, visited me in Chad during one of the exercises. So for instance, women are the only one who can put in the map the medicinal plant and the remaining fresh water sources. By doing so, they help the whole communities to build an adaptation and resilience. We build it around Lake Chad, over 3,500 kilometers squares of mapping. And to do so, we just talk to the peoples. We listen to them. Even if they didn't get the chance to go to school, they are the one who can better know their landscape, and they can build a sustainable solution for themselves. And this project helped also to give a land rights to the women that they can do an agroecology, and they can protect the biodiversity and generate an income for their children. So today, my top recommendation to you are these people should be a top priorities of your list. And you should make everything to help them to get direct access finance to build the resilience. Respecting the indigenous people rights, and particularly the land right, is not negotiable. We know that the world is facing a new era of food insecurity. At the end of the day, it will put more pressure on our forests and our land. And there is a major risk that the big companies and even the state try to grab our land where we protect the ecosystem for centuries. So, all the decision makers, from the government to the business, should make it clear grabbing land and destroying ecosystem it's not an option. They should make sure that safeguard and free, prior, and informed consent of the communities are everywhere. If not, we all risk to accelerate the climate change and the loss of biodiversity rather than building a strengthening solutions. My last word to you today is, we can still make a difference. We can make it only if we act all together on the ground with concrete projects. If everyone on this planet install a solar panel, develop a small-scale agriculture, stop consuming what destroying our forests, then we will make it. What leaders have failed to do on climate change, we can do it. Happy 20th anniversary.